What if the deadliest weapon of the Nephilim was not the giants themselves, but their daughters? This question opens a door that most readers of ancient texts have never dared to enter. For generations, the spotlight has fallen on the colossal male warriors of the pre-flood world. Their strength, their violence, their cities, their downfall. But buried beneath that familiar story lies a hidden file, a forgotten record that whispers of something far more unsettling. This is the file of the Forbidden Daughters. And once you open it, the entire narrative of Genesis and the Book of Enoch begins to shift. The ancient world described in Enoch chapters 7 and 8 is not only a world of giant men, it is also a world where human women gave birth to giants of immense height. Traditions speak of 3,000 cubits. That number is symbolic, but the message is clear. The births were beyond nature. Through these women, a female giant class emerged. These were the daughters of the Watchers. They were the daughters of human mothers. And they were the first generation of beings we now call the Giantesses. But the Forbidden Lineage was never only about size. It was about purpose. It was about strategy. The daughters carried something the male giants could never wield. They bore the wombs that could expand the hybrid race. They carried the bloodlines that could shape entire nations. And they were taught the arts that could seduce, manipulate, and rule. The Watchers did not create only warriors. They created queens. While the sons of the Nephilim ravaged the earth with brute force, their sisters were trained to conquer it in a different way. The Book of Enoch describes forbidden knowledge given to women, beauty rituals, eye painting, jewelry, enchantments, sorcery, astrology. These were not simple lessons in adornment. In the ancient world, these were tools of influence. They were the keys to desire, to domination, and to control. And from these tools arose a line of female rulers whose power did not come from the sword, but from the soul. This is why the Forbidden Lineage matters. When we shift our gaze from the male giants to the female giants, the entire pre-flood world begins to look different. We no longer see a world ruled only by violence. We see a world guided by queens. Queens who shaped marriages. Queens who forged alliances. Queens who used beauty, magic, and prophecy to bend kings and cities toward the will of the Watchers. In this video, we will open this forgotten file page by page. First, we will uncover who the Giantesses were according to Enoch. Then we will explore how the Watchers trained them through cosmetics, sorcery, and enchantment. We will look at how this forbidden female lineage helped build the empires that filled the earth with corruption before the flood. We will examine why heaven targeted their wombs in the judgment of the flood. And we will trace the echoes of the giantess spirit across the ancient world and into modern culture. By the end of this journey, you will face a question that cannot be ignored. Were the giantesses simply background figures in a forgotten myth? Or were they the hidden heart of a genocidal plan against humanity? That answer begins now. To understand the rise of the Forbidden Lineage, we must return to the passage that has puzzled readers for millennia, Genesis chapter 6. It is one of the shortest and most mysterious sections in the entire Bible. Yet within 4 brief verses, it sets the stage for a war of bloodlines that shaped the ancient world. Genesis describes a moment when the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. The ancient Hebrew tradition presents the sons of God as angelic beings. These are the Watchers. They are not myth. They are not metaphors. They are presented as real beings who crossed a line they were never meant to cross. The daughters of men are not supernatural. They are ordinary human women. They are the women of early civilization, mothers, wives, daughters. But they carried the one thing the Watchers lacked. They carried the ability to create life in their own likeness. From this forbidden union came the Nephilim. Genesis calls them mighty men of renown, warriors, heroes, titans in the memory of ancient cultures. But the text is silent about the details. We are told only enough to sense that something has gone terribly wrong. Human history had collided with a realm beyond human boundaries. This is where the Book of Enoch pulls back the curtain. Enoch expands the scene with striking clarity. He describes the Watchers gathering on Mount Hermon. They meet in secret. They form a pact. They swear an oath. And they decide, with full awareness, to break the divine boundary that separates the heavenly realm from the human world. Their rebellion is not an accident. It is a coordinated campaign. They do not only take wives. They launch a project. They begin a deliberate program of hybridization. They introduce forbidden knowledge. They pass down secrets that reshape culture, technology, warfare, medicine, and sorcery. And they create a new race that does not belong to heaven and does not belong to earth. But to understand the true depth of this rebellion, we must shift our focus. Most readers imagine the Nephilim as only male giants, tall warriors, violent kings, destroyers of the land. Yet a lineage does not survive through warriors alone. If a race is to grow across generations, it requires sons and daughters. It requires a network of marriages. It requires wombs. It requires mothers. This is the missing link in the story, and it is a link that Enoch allows us to see. Human women did not give birth to a single generation of giants. The language of Enoch suggests that these births continued. Mothers produced giant sons. Mothers produced giant daughters. And from these daughters rose a hidden class of hybrid women, silent in most retellings, yet essential to the very survival of the Nephilim. From a biological perspective, the logic is simple. If there were giant males, there must have been giant females. Without them, the hybrid race would have died as quickly as it appeared. There would have been no second generation, no third generation, no spread of giant tribes across the earth. This is why the idea of the Giantesses matters. Even if the Bible and Enoch emphasize the violent acts of the male giants, their world could not have existed without a female structure behind it. A structure capable of bearing children. A structure capable of making alliances. A structure capable of sustaining a hybrid empire. The traditions around Enoch hint at this silent female presence. The Watchers did not teach their secrets only to men. They taught them to women. They shaped the mothers. They shaped the daughters. And from these teachings emerged a class of giant women who stood at the core of the forbidden bloodline. When we place the Giantesses back into the story, the ancient world begins to look different. The rise of wickedness is no longer only a tale of brute strength. It becomes a tale of strategy. It becomes a tale of reproduction. It becomes a tale of influence and seduction. And it becomes a story where the female side of the Nephilim plays a role as vital as the male. This leads us to a question that hangs over the entire narrative. If the Nephilim males terrorized the earth, what were their sisters and daughters doing? Were they standing silently in the background, or were they sitting on thrones? In the next section, we will explore the answer. We will step deeper into the world of Enoch and uncover how the daughters of the Watchers became the wombs of a hybrid empire. To understand the rise of the Forbidden Lineage, we must follow the story to its most strategic point, the womb. In the world described by Enoch, the womb becomes the battlefield where two realms collide. It is the place where the Watchers lay the foundation of a new species. It is the place where human women carry beings that do not belong to the natural order. And it is the place where the daughters of this hybrid race rise as the true engines of its expansion. Enoch chapter 7 paints a scene that is both simple and terrifying. Human women became pregnant, and they gave birth to great giants. The ancient text does not give a scientific explanation. It speaks with the voice of a storyteller. It shows us human bodies trying to hold something beyond their design. It shows us births that break the boundaries of nature. And it shows us the beginning of a race that grows in strength and number. Some traditions describe these giants as 3,000 cubits tall. This number is symbolic. It does not describe a measurement. It describes excess. It describes something that cannot be contained by the normal world. It tells us that the giants were born not only large in body, but large in impact. They were born to dominate. They were born to spread. But the key to understanding the rise of the giantesses is this. The Watchers did not create a single moment of chaos. They created a system, a cycle, a lineage that could continue. And that lineage depended on the daughters as much as the sons. Many people read the story of the Nephilim as if it were a world filled only with giant men, warriors, hunters, kings. But Enoch suggests a deeper truth. These men could not build nations without mothers. They could not pass their blood into the future without wives. They could not raise another generation without daughters who could bear the next wave of hybrid children. The giantesses were not an accident. They were a requirement. From the moment they were born, they carried the potential to reproduce the hybrid line without the limitations of a human mother. A human woman could produce giants only through the direct union with a watcher. But a giantess could produce giants through ordinary marriage within the hybrid race. This changed everything. It meant the Nephilim could grow into tribes. It meant the hybrid bloodline could spread across vast regions. It meant the influence of the Watchers could continue long after the original rebellion. In other words, the daughters of the Nephilim were the wombs of an empire. Each giantess was a living factory of future kings. A mother who could give birth to the next generation of rulers. A woman whose body carried the strength, size, and supernatural traits of the forbidden bloodline. And as the generations grew, the giantesses became the center of alliances, marriages, and dynasties. This is where the difference between the giant males and the giant females becomes clear. The male giants represented war. They represented violence. They controlled territory through force. Their impact was loud. Their destruction was visible. They filled the earth with bloodshed. But their power ended at the edge of the battlefield. The female giants represented something different. They controlled the future. They arranged marriages. They forged alliances. They used beauty, seduction, and influence to guide kings and cities. They shaped the children who would rule after the fathers were gone. Their impact was quiet. It was subtle. It was lasting. In the ancient world, almost every major civilization speaks of queen mothers, of goddess queens, of divine mothers of kings. These stories appear in many cultures. We do not claim that these figures are the giantesses themselves, but the patterns are familiar. They echo the idea that behind every ancient king stands a powerful mother, a mother who is more than a parent, a mother who is the architect of a dynasty. The Forbidden Lineage follows this same pattern. It survives because of the women. It spreads because of the women. And it becomes dangerous because of the women. Male giants could devastate a generation. Female giants could reshape the world. This is the spiritual heart of the story. The Watchers did not only create warriors to corrupt the earth. They created a lineage, a dynasty, a program of reproduction that would carry their rebellion into every corner of humanity. The Giantesses held the key. If they were removed, the entire system would collapse. If they remained, the hybrid race would endure. This is why the Giantesses matter in the narrative of Enoch. They are not background figures. They are the root. They are the center. They are the reason the hybrid race became a threat to the very fabric of creation. And yet, the story of the Forbidden Lineage does not rest on biology alone. Enoch tells us something even more disturbing. The daughters were not only born, they were shaped, they were educated, they were trained. We now step into one of the darkest parts of the ancient world. But bloodlines do not spread by biology alone. Enoch says the Giantesses were not only born, they were trained. When we open the next page of the Forbidden Daughters file, we step into one of the most unsettling chapters in the ancient record. It is the moment when the Watchers shifted their strategy from the body to the soul. They had created a hybrid race through forbidden unions. Now they would teach these daughters how to rule. Not with the sword, not with brute strength, but with beauty, seduction, and spiritual manipulation. Enoch chapter 8 gives us a rare window into this hidden curriculum. It tells us what the Watchers taught the women of the pre-flood world. They taught them how to paint their eyes. They taught them how to decorate themselves with precious stones. They introduced them to the use of cosmetics. They revealed the art of adornment that could turn the human face into a tool of influence. And then they went deeper. They taught enchantments. They taught sorcery. They taught how to use roots, herbs, and rituals to bend desire, predict outcomes, and control decisions. They revealed the secrets of the stars. They taught astrology, the reading of patterns in the sky, the mapping of fate according to heavenly signs. None of these teachings was simple. None of them were harmless. In the ancient world, beauty and magic were not separate categories. They worked together. Cosmetics were used to awaken desire, to amplify attraction, to direct attention. But when paired with sorcery, beauty became a spiritual weapon. A painted eye could captivate, a charm could bind, a whisper could influence the course of a kingdom. This is why the Watchers focused their teaching on women. A male giant could crush a city, a female giant could control it. In this system, the Giantesses were not ordinary students. They were the elite. They were the ones who carried the hybrid blood in its purest form. They were the ones destined to shape dynasties and alliances. They were the ones who could use beauty and magic with a power far beyond any human woman. And so the Watchers poured into them the full measure of forbidden knowledge. Imagine the world that Enoch describes. Imagine palaces filled with giant queens. These queens are adorned with jewels that shimmer like fire. Their eyes are painted with a darkness that pulls in the gaze. Their voices speak enchantments that stir the hearts of warriors. Their rituals fill the night with visions. Their understanding of the stars guides the decisions of entire cities. In these courts, the air itself seems to bend to their will. Their power is not the power of height or muscle. It is the power of influence. It is the power that turns kings into servants. It is the power that makes armies fight for causes they do not understand. It is the power that shapes the emotional atmosphere of entire nations. This is the true agenda of the Giantesses: to rule not through domination of the battlefield, but through domination of desire. This is why alliances formed around them. Human kings sought them, not only because of their beauty, not only because of their size, but because marrying a giantess meant inheriting a connection to the Watchers. It meant access to forbidden knowledge. It meant participation in the hybrid bloodline. These marriages created powerful mixed courts. They created networks of influence that spread through cities and regions. Through these unions, the forbidden lineage tightened its grip on humanity. And as we look at this pattern, we begin to see echoes that have never fully disappeared. Modern culture does not carry the bodies of the giants, but it carries the same obsessions: the worship of beauty, the rise of glamour as a form of power, the hunger for spiritual guidance through astrology, the fascination with soft magic, the blending of identity, desire, mysticism, and self-exaltation. These are not the same acts as the forbidden arts of the Watchers, but they echo the same structure. They echo the same temptation. They echo the same invitation to reshape destiny through enchanted appearance. This is the central truth of the Giantess agenda. Their bodies made them giants, but their influence made them rulers. They were not only the daughters of the Watchers, they were the queens of seduction, queens who guided kingdoms from behind veils of beauty and spells, queens whose power was rooted in the soul rather than the sword. And so we must ask the question that rises naturally from Enoch's account. If the sons of the Nephilim ruled with brute strength, did the daughters rule with enchantment? In the next part, we will step inside the courts of these forbidden queens. We will explore how their influence built the pre-flood empires that filled the earth with corruption. To understand the true shape of the pre-flood world, we must lift our eyes from the battlefield and look toward the throne room. Genesis tells us that the earth was filled with violence. Enoch tells us who filled it. The Nephilim did not wander the world as isolated monsters. They built cities. They established kingdoms. They created systems of power that spread across the land. And wherever there were giant kings, there were also giant queens. At the center of these early empires, the daughters of the Watchers sat not in the shadows, but on the thrones. Imagine the ancient world in the days before the flood. Cities rise like mountains. Walls tower above the plains. The foundations are carved by enormous hands. The streets tremble beneath the footsteps of giant warriors. But the true heart of these cities lies in their palaces. There, giant males hold swords and spears. But the giantesses hold something far more subtle and far more enduring. They hold the scepter of influence. In these courts, the queens guide the direction of kingdoms. Their beauty, enhanced by the forbidden arts of the Watchers, draws the eyes of nobles and warriors. Their enchantments shape emotions. Their rituals shape decisions. Their counsel, flavored with the secrets of sorcery and astrology, guides the thoughts of kings. They act as priestesses. They act as mothers. They act as rulers in everything but name. Enoch's account helps us reconstruct this world. The Nephilim were not simple brutes. They established dominion. They were the first empire builders. They controlled trade, land, and armies. Their presence filled the earth with corruption because their system was built on the blending of divine rebellion and human submission. And the giantesses were the center of that system. Through them, the lineage continued. Through them, alliances were forged. Through them, rituals and ceremonies carried the hybrid culture into every corner of society. In these pre-flood kingdoms, marriage was not only a personal union, it was a political act. A human king who married a giantess gained access to power beyond his own tribe. His children would carry the hybrid blood. His dynasty would stand above other human rulers. But he would also be bound to the Watchers and their agenda. In this way, the forbidden lineage spread through the royal families of the ancient world. It shaped the next generation not only through birth, but through culture and belief. Within these courts, childbirth itself became a weapon. Every son born to a giantess could become a king. Every daughter could become a queen. Every child carried the potential to extend the hybrid race further. This is why the giantesses were the heart of the thrones. They determined who would be born. They determined which marriages would be arranged. They determined what rituals would be performed. They determined the spiritual direction of entire cities. As we consider this picture, we find echoes in the myths of many ancient civilizations. We find goddesses of war. We find queens of love. We find mothers of kings. We find figures who blend beauty, power, and divinity. We do not claim these figures are the giantesses themselves, but the pattern is familiar. Cultures often preserve memory through stories, and these stories may reflect the shadow of a deeper, older reality. A reality in which giant queens shaped nations long before written history. This brings us to the core of the theological pattern. The forbidden lineage was not an accidental mixture of angelic and human blood. It was a deliberate attempt to replace humanity. Not simply by overwhelming it with violence, but by creating a rival species that would dominate the future. A species with human form and supernatural influence. A species whose female members held the power to expand or extinguish entire bloodlines. The pre-flood world, as presented in Genesis and Enoch, was not just a world of chaos. It was a world of rival thrones. On one side stood the family of Noah, clinging to the commandments of God. On the other side stood the hybrid empires, built on seduction, sorcery, and the rule of the forbidden queens. If the forbidden daughters sat at the heart of this world, then the story of the flood takes on a new meaning. The flood becomes more than a natural disaster. It becomes more than a punishment for violence. It becomes a direct strike against the thrones of the giant queens. It becomes a judgment that targets the centers of hybrid power. It becomes the dismantling of an empire built on the wombs of the Nephilim. And so we arrive at the question that leads us to the next chapter. If the forbidden queens sat at the heart of pre-flood power, then the flood itself was more than a storm. It was a strike against their thrones. In the next part, we will explore why heaven targeted the womb. We will see why the flood was not only the end of a generation, but the end of a lineage. When the waters of the flood rose and covered the earth, the judgment was far deeper than a simple act of destruction. It was a surgical strike against a lineage. It was the end of a genetic rebellion. And it was aimed with precision at the very place where the forbidden lineage sustained its power, the womb. The language of Scripture gives us the first clue. Genesis declares that all flesh had corrupted its way on the earth. This is more than moral corruption. It is corruption of kind, corruption of order, corruption of the boundaries that God had established between the heavenly realm and the human world. And in that same passage, Noah is described as perfect in his generations. This phrase does not point to moral perfection. It points to bloodline. It tells us that Noah's lineage remained untouched by the hybrid contamination that spread across the ancient world. When we connect Genesis with Enoch, the picture becomes clearer. Enoch describes the judgment of the watchers. They are bound. They are imprisoned in darkness until the day of final reckoning. Their power is cut off. Their influence is removed from the world. But their children, the giants, face a different fate. They are destroyed. Their bodies perish in the flood. Their spirits remain as restless beings roaming the earth. These are described as the unclean spirits that haunt later ages. But even this does not explain why the flood needed to be so total, so sweeping, so absolute. The answer lies in what we have seen in the previous parts. The power of the forbidden lineage did not rest primarily in the male giants. It rested in the women who could continue the line. It rested in the wombs of the giantesses. If heaven intended to stop the hybrid race completely, it could not simply defeat the warriors. It had to end the dynasty. It had to end the reproductive engine. It had to end the birth of new hybrid generations. This is the womb logic behind the flood. It reveals that God's judgment was not only about behavior. It was about species. It was about identity. It was about the boundary between the divine and the human, a boundary that had been shattered by the unions on Mount Hermon. The giantesses stood as living proof that the boundary had been broken. Every child they carried was a reminder of the rebellion. Every birth extended the influence of the Watchers. Every new generation made the hybrid race harder to remove. Their wombs were the final and most powerful tool of the Forbidden Empire. And so the judgment of the flood was designed to reach them. Thrones are swept away. Cities built by giant hands sink beneath the waves. The palaces of the giant queens are buried underwater. The centers of their rituals, their enchantments, their alliances all disappear beneath the deep. The line of hybrid queens ends where the waters begin. The wombs that once produced giants are silenced. The dynasty that spread through marriage, seduction, and power is cut down at the root. This is the heart of the theological pattern. The judgment of the flood is not only directed at what the hybrid race did, it is directed at what the hybrid race was. The Watchers crossed a boundary of being. The giantesses continued that boundary crossing with every child they brought into the world. Their very existence declared a challenge to the created order. Their reproduction was an act of continued rebellion. And so the flood, in its sweeping force, targeted the entire system of hybrid reproduction. When the waters receded, the world was changed. The thrones of the forbidden queens were gone. Their palaces lay in ruins beneath the earth. Their line was cut off. Their future was erased. For the first time since the rebellion began, humanity stood without the shadow of the Giantess dynasty. But even as the waters dried, a haunting question remained. A question that rises from the pages of Genesis and echoes through the stories of the Old Testament. A question that scholars, theologians, and seekers have wrestled with for generations. If the flood ended the first reign of the Giantesses, a question still haunts the story. Did the forbidden lineage ever return? In the next part, we will follow that question into the world after the flood. We will search for echoes of the hybrid bloodline, and we will seek to understand whether the daughters of the Nephilim truly disappeared, or whether their influence resurfaced in unexpected ways. When the waters of the flood receded and the earth began to breathe again, humanity stood at a new beginning. The thrones of the giant queens were gone. Their palaces lay buried beneath the deep. Their lineage, once so powerful, seemed to vanish in a single generation. Yet the question that haunts the ancient story still lingers. Did the forbidden lineage truly end, or did its echoes rise again in the world after the flood? The Bible offers a surprising clue. When Israel enters the land centuries later, they do not face normal human nations. They face tribes described in the same language used for the giants before the flood. These tribes include the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, and the Zamzumim. They are not isolated individuals. They are whole nations of giants. Numbers, families, dynasties, kings like Og of Bashan, who is described by the size of his bed as a sign of his extraordinary stature. These accounts force us to ask a simple but unavoidable question. If giants existed after the flood, then someone had to give birth to them. There must have been mothers who carried the blood. There must have been women whose lineage preserved, in some hidden form, the genetic trace of the Nephilim. These tribes did not appear out of nowhere. They multiplied, they spread, they sustained their numbers. And that means the shadow of the giantesses did not vanish as completely as we might imagine. The Bible gives us no direct description of female giants after the flood. But the existence of giant nations implies that their mothers were present, even if unnoticed by the text. Behind every giant warrior stood a woman capable of bearing him. Behind every giant king stood a lineage that made his size possible. And behind the rise of these giant tribes stood an echo of the forgotten queens who once shaped the world. This leads us to one of the most intriguing theories in the study of Genesis, the idea of a genetic Trojan horse. Scripture tells us that Noah was perfect in his generations. His lineage was uncorrupted. But the Bible does not say the same about the wives of his sons. Their origins are not described. Their families are not identified. Their bloodlines are not traced. Scripture is silent. If even one of these women carried a recessive trace of the hybrid DNA, then the pattern could re-emerge generations later, not immediately. Not in Noah's sons, but in their descendants. And it is in the descendants of Ham, particularly through Canaan, that the giant tribes arise. The Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzamim, kingdoms that Israel would face many centuries after the waters of judgment had dried. We do not claim this theory as dogma. We present it as a case file, an attempt to connect the threads between Genesis, Enoch, and the later biblical record. The presence of giant nations after the flood demands an explanation, and the idea of a hidden maternal line carried unknowingly into the New World offers a possibility that fits both the text and the pattern. This brings us back to the theme of the Forbidden Lineage. If the pre-flood world was shaped by giant queens who influenced kings, guided alliances, and directed the soul of civilization, then the post-flood world would carry at least a faint memory of that pattern. In the Old Testament, we find hints of queen mothers who shape dynasties. We find stories of cursed mothers whose influence marks entire family lines. We find women whose decisions redirect the fate of kings and kingdoms. We do not identify these women as giantesses. We simply observe that the pattern of powerful mothers standing behind the thrones of nations continues. In the world of Canaan, where giant tribes thrived, it is not hard to imagine that similar figures existed. Hidden queens, mothers who shaped their sons into the towering warriors Israel feared. Women who carried the ancient echo of the forbidden bloodline. Women whose influence maintained the spirit of the giant nations long after the bodies of the original giantesses were lost beneath the flood. Whether the Nephilim blood returned through recessive genetics, through supernatural intervention, or through some other mystery not revealed in Scripture, the result is clear. The pattern returned. The giants reappeared. The threat resurfaced. And the ancient conflict between the pure lineage of Noah and the forbidden lineage of Canaan began once more. The question that rises from this evidence is not simply biological, it is spiritual. Blood can vanish, blood can re-emerge, but patterns endure. And the pattern of the forbidden queens did not die with the first world. It continued to echo through history. It shaped nations. It influenced kings. It whispered through the corridors of ancient temples and royal courts. Whether or not the blood returned in full, the spirit of the forbidden queens certainly did, and it has echoed through history ever since. In the next part, we will follow this pattern into the world of myths, cultures, and modern society. We will explore how the image of the giantess survives even when her body is gone. As we move deeper into this investigation, a shift becomes necessary. Up to this point, we have traced bodies, the giant bodies of the pre-flood world, the hybrid mothers who shaped nations, the lineages that rose from their wombs. But after the flood, something changes. The physical line grows weaker. The bodies disappear from the stage of history, yet the influence remains. What survives is not a race of giant women, but a pattern, a spirit, a way of shaping culture through beauty, seduction, mysticism, and power. This is the giantess spirit. This spirit is not about extraordinary height or physical size. It is about a structure of influence. It is about a combination of female power, sexual allure, spiritual manipulation, and the desire to control. It is the use of sensuality as a tool. It is the blending of mysticism with identity. It is the temptation to redefine the self apart from God. And throughout Scripture, this pattern appears again and again. The Bible speaks of the seductive woman who leads nations astray. It speaks of queens who influence kings toward idolatry. It speaks of the figure in prophetic literature who represents a city, a system, and a spirit that seduces rulers with luxury, enchantment, and immorality. These figures are not identified as giantesses, but they reflect the same pattern. They use beauty as a weapon. They use desire as a snare. They shape the destiny of kingdoms through influence rather than force. This is what we call pattern theology. It is the recognition that certain patterns of spiritual influence repeat across time. They may appear in different cultures and in different forms, but their core remains the same. And when we compare these biblical patterns with the picture of the forbidden queens in Enoch, we begin to see an echo. Not proof of a specific individual, but a resonance, a shadow, a continuation of the same strategy that once guided the daughters of the Watchers. When we turn to the ancient world, the echoes become even louder. Many civilizations worshipped goddesses of love, war, and fertility. These goddesses were often depicted as beautiful, alluring, and powerful. They held sway over kings. Their temples blended sexuality with religious ritual. Their followers believed that intimacy with the goddess could bring power, prosperity, or spiritual insight. These cults tied seduction to the sacred. They united sexuality and mysticism, and they placed female images at the center of spiritual and political life. We do not claim these goddesses were giantesses, but the structure resembles the world described by Enoch. Queens who blend beauty and power, rituals guided by female priestesses, kingdoms shaped by enchantment rather than force, a system where desire becomes a form of worship. As we step into the modern world, the echoes continue. Today, we do not worship statues in temples, but our culture holds up the human body as an object of devotion. The beauty industry spans nations. The pursuit of physical perfection has become a cultural obsession. Alongside this, a fascination with soft magic has grown. Astrology, tarot, witch aesthetics. Spirituality that focuses on self-creation and self-exaltation. These practices are often presented as harmless or empowering, yet they echo the same blend we saw in the days of Enoch. Beauty joined with mysticism, self-expression joined with spiritual identity, desire joined with the temptation to become one's own guide, one's own destiny, one's own God. This is not about condemning individuals. It is about recognizing a pattern that reappears across history, a pattern where beauty becomes a tool of influence, where mysticism becomes a path to control, where seduction becomes spiritual, where the idea of a higher authority is replaced by the worship of the self, a pattern that reflects in a subtle form the same strategy once used by the daughters of the Watchers. This is why the concept of the forbidden lineage still matters. The bodies of the Nephilim may be gone. Their queens may be long buried beneath the waters of the flood. But their ideas remain. Their strategies remain. Their patterns remain. And the modern world is filled with voices that echo their message. You can be your own goddess. Rewrite your own design. Rewrite your destiny. Rewrite your identity. Shape yourself according to your own desire. The ancient queens once used these ideas to pull nations away from the living God. Today, these ideas reappear in new forms. Through media, through culture, through technology, through the promise of self-creation without limit. And so the question we face is no longer only about the past. It is not only about whether the giantesses once lived. It is not only about whether their lineage survived the flood. It is about the line you and I will follow in our own generation. In the next and final part, we will bring the entire case file together. We will ask whether the story of the Giantesses is simply myth, or whether it is a map of an ancient war that still shapes humanity today. As we close this case file, we return to the opening question. Were the Giantesses simply forgotten daughters of the Nephilim, or were they the hidden heart of a war that shaped the destiny of humanity? After following the trail from Genesis to Enoch, from the pre-flood world to modern culture, the answer becomes far more complex than legend or myth. Let us recap what we have uncovered. Enoch chapters 7 and 8 describe a world where human women gave birth to giants. These women were taught the forbidden arts of beauty, enchantment, and sorcery. Through these teachings, the forbidden lineage emerged. A lineage built not only through the bodies of hybrid giants, but through the influence and power of the women who shaped them. These daughters held the wombs that carried the future of the hybrid race. They held the bloodlines that extended the rebellion. They held the tools of seduction and control that shaped the hearts of kings and the direction of nations. The flood was not only a judgment on violence, it was a judgment on this entire system. It struck the giants on the battlefield, it struck the watchers in their rebellion, and it struck the giantesses in their wombs. It cut off the dynasty at its root. It washed away the palaces, the rituals, and the thrones of the forbidden queens. Yet echoes of the forbidden daughters appear again in the Old Testament. Giant nations rise in Canaan. Patterns of queen mothers and cursed mothers shape dynasties. Seductive spirits draw leaders toward idolatry. These are not direct proofs of surviving giantesses, but they reflect the same strategy. They show how the influence of the ancient queens continued, even when their bodies were gone. The heart of this story is not simply about ancient history. It is about the image of God in humanity. The plan of darkness has always targeted the same places: the womb and the bloodline, the body and the identity, the male and female design created by God. The temptation to use beauty, sexuality, mysticism, and power to draw hearts away from the Creator is not new. It is a continuation of the same pattern that shaped the forbidden queens long ago. This leaves us with two ways to interpret everything we have explored. The first way is simple. You can see this as mythology, a dramatic story, a fascinating narrative that ends when the video ends. The second way is deeper. You can see this as a strategic map, a pattern that exposes the tactics used across time. From the forbidden lineage before the flood, to the seductive spiritual systems of the ancient world, to the modern culture of self-deification and soft occult practices that surround us today. If the ancient queens used beauty, seduction, and enchantment to shape kingdoms, then it is not surprising that our world still wrestles with these same forces. The invitation is the same. Redefine yourself, exalt yourself, rewrite your design, become your own goddess. But there is another path, a path that calls us to live with discernment, to recognize how the world uses sex, beauty, power, and spiritual confusion to pull us away from the presence of God. A path that invites us to place our bodies, our souls, and our identities under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, rather than under the pressure to become something we were never created to be. So now the question comes to you. Do you believe the Giantesses were just forgotten daughters of the Nephilim, or were they the forbidden heart of a war for humanity's future? Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what you see in this pattern. You may see something others have missed. And if you want to continue this investigation, the next files are already waiting. Genetic Trojan Horse on Noah's Ark, or Council of Laodicea, who deleted Enoch's daughters. Join us as part of this fellowship of seekers by subscribing and continuing the search. The story of the Forbidden Lineage is only the beginning.